U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Monday the United States strongly supports Italy's initiative to focus the fight against the Islamic State militia on Africa. Speaking after the ministerial gathering of the global coalition to defeat Daesh and ISIS in Italy's capital in Rome, Blinken also said that a discussion on Syria would focus on how to get humanitarian assistance into the country.
In an unknown location, fighters from the Nigerian militant group Boko Haram are seen apparently pledging allegiance to Islamic State's West African arm. The video raises fear that the group, known as Islamic State West African Province, or ISWAP, is consolidating control of the insurgency in northeastern Nigeria. And it's perhaps one reason why the threat posed by Islamic State in Africa was at the heart of talks between US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Italian Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio on Monday. Di Maio said he had proposed an international working group to identify and halt the terrorist threat connected with Islamic State in the continent. Blinken added that Italy has Washington's backing.
That we strongly support Italy's initiative to make sure that the coalition against Daesh focuses its expertise on Africa, while keeping our eye closely on Syria and on Iraq.
The militant video, which was produced by Islamic State's official media operation, comes weeks after the death of Boko Haram leader Abu Bakr Shekau. The groups have been embroiled in a violent rivalry for years, but if Islamic State absorbs Boko Haram fighters, it could focus on attacking the Nigerian military. The footage showed several hundred men, some of whom were armed, and included statements to the camera.
We are saying to our Ikhwan, we should not relent in our effort to fight the kuffar.
However, some are not convinced that the footage is evidence all Boko Haram fighters are ready to join. Bulama Bukati, a senior analyst with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, dismissed it as propaganda and noted that senior Boko Haram leaders were not featured. Around 350,000 people have died as a result of the 12-year insurgency and subsequent humanitarian crisis, the United Nations said this week.
For some analysis on this, we're now joined by David Otto, who's an international defence and counter-terrorism consultant from the UK in London. David, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you.
So how would you assess the first in-person meeting in 2 years of this global coalition of ministers working together to defeat ISIS or Daesh in Rome?
Of course, every effort to counter the threat that is posed by Daesh, but not just Daesh, but also Al-Qaeda factions. Because remember, Al-Qaeda is still very much active, across the globe. So I think any union to discuss the threat that is posed by Daesh should be welcome. But I also think that if this specific meeting was to evaluate, but also to focus on Africa, what I would have expected to see would have been this meeting to take place somewhere in Africa rather than in Rome, because I know very much, well, as many of my colleagues do, that the focus of Daesh has shifted away from when it was last defeated in its stronghold in Raqqa and Mosul. It has now moved towards Africa, especially the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin. And as one of the commentators made it very clear, countries like Nigeria are facing the greatest threat, with a formation of a union between the Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State of West Africa Province, but also the former Boko Haram faction of Abu Bakr Shekau, who committed suicide sometime recently. So I think, even though we are appreciating, or that it should be appreciated, that such a meeting has taken place, I so much believe that African countries should have taken a front role. They shouldn't have just been, asked to attend as observers. But also, I think it's important for the world to understand that if Africa is unstable, then the rest of the world is going to be unstable.
All right, let's talk about what brought them together in the first instance was always Syria and Iraq, really, wasn't it? And I just wonder, what's in it still for them in terms of managing ISIS and Daesh?
There is still much left that has not been resolved. I mean, the global coalition against Daesh, had its aim to defeat the Islamic State completely. If you look at the terror triangle, which is something that I talk about most of the time, is that there are three areas that needs a lot more focus. But I'll come to the fourth one, which I'll add onto that. The first one is to be able to deny Daesh its capacity, its recruitment, its weapons, its hold or its claim of having an Islamic State. That has been partially achieved, by so-called removing the so-called Daesh Caliphate, which was situated between Raqqa and Mosul. Now, but what about the ideology, which is one part of that triangle, which is the second part of the triangle, but also the most important? That hasn't been touched. Daesh still continues to expound its extremist ideology. The third angle is that it continues to carry out attacks, even within Iraq and Syria itself. So there is still the high risk that, the local population, soft targets, hard military targets, as we've seen in Africa, are continuously being targeted by foreign fighters. And the fourth part of it, which I did mention, is the fact that you have more than 10,000 foreign fighters, some women, children, families of those fighters still held in detention camps by the SDF forces, that's the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're still there in parts of Iraq and Syria. And most of the European states, but also the African states, have failed to take back some of these foreign fighters who went there to fight. So there hasn't been an achievement on that part. And this Pacific Conference was called upon to talk to member states to come to Iraq and Syria, identify those who travel to these areas, the women and children who travel to these areas, and try and see how they can take them back for rehabilitation and reintegration.
Africa is now on their radar, and they want to set up a special task team, I guess, to look at the rise in insurgency in the Sahel. What is in it for these Western countries to help Africa? Is it benevolence, or is it looking after mineral resources and other interests?
Of course, Africa is always an interest to the West, but it is not for the interest of the West to have Africa stable as it would be for Africans. So I think that should be made very clear. Now, the instability that has bedeviled the African countries has also been partially, if not mostly, by the fact that when Daesh was targeted in Iraq and Syria, most of the foreign fighters were allowed, or these countries just looked away, and these foreign fighters, more than 5,000 of them, that's just the AU's own records, traveled towards Libya and then went to the Sahel, joined forces with ISWAP in Nigeria. They've now formed an extra branch in Mozambique. You have, Daesh established between the borders of Uganda and also DRC Congo. You've got Al-Shabaab still growing in strength with both Daesh faction and Al-Qaeda faction there. And this is one of the reasons why countries like DRC Congo, but also Mozambique were invited, to join this forum. But they were just observers. So I think what is important for African countries, but perhaps the AU, if it does have the capacity to do, is to be able to develop an African coalition against the Islamic State, which is developing very much in parts of not just East Africa, Central Africa, in the Lake Chad Basin, which is part of West Africa, but also in the north, which is linked with Libya. So the African Union has to understand that the threat It's so much so that we cannot rely on the West alone, because their interest is principally to secure their borders.
The insurgents and militants that are in Africa, are they directly linked in terms of reporting to Daesh, ISIS, if we want to call it that, command structure, where is it? Or are these almost like franchises that run themselves under the banner of ISIS?
It depends on which of the areas you're looking at. Daesh has a very strategic relationship, but it also has ideological connections with some of these countries. They run the same Salafi jihadist Wahhabism, the so-called extremist form of it. They believe in that. They preach the establishment of, wilayats, which is like provinces of the Islamic or the so-called Islamic Caliphate. They also have direct advice, from, Daesh core. I mean, I was listening to an audio which was played by the Islamic State of West Africa province, which, literally said that, they had been instructed to suspend their leadership by the Islamic State core. And we did see another audio by Boko Haram faction, as the United, they pledged allegiance to Ibrahim al-Qurashi, who is now the current Islamic State core leader. So there has been not just a strategic connection between Daesh and these countries in West Africa. Of course, they've pledged allegiance already to the Islamic State core. We've seen operational engagement. We've seen them exchanging allegiances. So, I mean, the connection cannot be taken away. But what one has to be very clear is that most of these factions are independent, in a local sense, because they explore the dynamics within each country where they operate in. They continuously raise funds within those countries. Some of them have assistance outside their countries, but I think what survives, these countries or these jihadist groups in Africa or in the countries where they do exist is the ability to exploit local dynamics. But the links between them and the Islamic State core is very powerful.
In Europe, they're talking about continuing to suppress and keep them contained. In Africa, it's a completely different story, though, isn't it? I mean, it's almost out of control, particularly in the Sahel.
I think none of these strategies are winning. Containment is what Daesh really likes. I mean, the lesson that the Islamic State core has learned from the mistakes of Al-Qaeda, if I can call that, is that you cannot sustain a caliphate. Because if you do sustain a caliphate, you don't have the ability to protect your airspace. You would always be overrun by the firepower of coalitions. So they know that. And what they're doing now is to use guerrilla-style tactics. They're forming insurgencies, which, they embed themselves within local communities that are vulnerable. They use propaganda online, to espouse, their love for this very deep and dark ideology. So they continuously win hearts and minds. So I think the tactic that needs to be used is one that goes beyond containing them. I think it's one that must be able to coordinate between how these groups use their ideology by employing what I call alternative narratives, but also counter narratives, and also to work with civil society organizations to deny these groups the ability and the space to continuously recruit vulnerable people. So I think it's a coordination of a long-term strategy. And each government must understand that military approach alone, even though effective in some sense, it's not enough.
All right, perhaps as a final question, is there a genuine concern that we should have that ISIS, Daesh can grow across the continent and perhaps start featuring in countries that have never had security issues before?
And that's the agenda of the Islamic State. I think what they're doing is to survive enough to expand. The more they sustain their operations, the more they continuously recruit, they will make a case to those who are very vulnerable that indeed, there is something here for you to join. There is something here for you to establish your own affiliate or your own province in some other country. And I think I often say that, terrorist groups have the time. What we have is just the clock. So they will always ensure that they continuously survive while politicians will be looking for votes. So what needs to be done in a sense globally? I know they say the coalition against Daesh is global, but it isn't global. I know it's more of a couple of states, about 80 or so. We need to have all countries roll into this, but also countries to develop their national counter-terrorism strategy that they can deal with these groups proactively, even before they act. Just a recent video of a Ghanaian who called himself a member of Daesh, calling Ghanaians from his location to join, is testament to the fact that these groups are still looking for new areas to explore, and we must not allow them to do that.
David, Otto, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much indeed. Your insights and analysis always greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.